Om Namah Shri Yatirajaya Vivekananda Suraye Satchit Sukha Swarupaya Swamine Tapaharine. In the past few decades, there's been we can call it a global craze for mindfulness. There are two main practices that are very popular in the West, which are taken from Indian spirituality. One is yoga, and the other is mindfulness. And you'll find in the US, in different countries in Europe, that almost every weekend there are spiritual retreats, where the whole weekend people will just devote themselves to mindfulness practice, mindfulness of the breath, mindfulness of the feelings that arise in the mind, mindfulness of thoughts. And these retreats are usually taught by Buddhist monks and Buddhist spiritual practitioners. What I'd like to talk about today is a different kind of mindfulness practice taught within Vedanta. So it's almost never talked about, but I think it's very important. Vedantic mindfulness is a special kind of spiritual practice that each one of us can practice, and I just want to talk about that a little bit. So Vedantic mindfulness is based on the idea that we are not the body and we are not the mind, but we are actually the eternal spiritual Atman beyond both the body and the mind complex. So whatever happens to us at the level of the physical body, whatever happens to us at the level of the mind, those are just the workings of Prakriti. Prakriti means nature. And Prakriti consists in the three gunas, Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. So as most of you probably know, when you have a preponderance of Sattva guna, the mind is very calm, you feel tranquil, you feel a sense of lightness and illumination. When you're full of Rajas, you become very restless, you want to do things constantly, you become a kind of busybody, and you have strong feelings like lust and anger. And when there's a preponderance of Tamas, Tamoguna, then you feel very lazy, you want to sleep all the time, you're prone to delusion. So Vedanta tells you that everything that happens at the level of the body, everything that happens at the level of the mind is just the working of these three gunas. And that you in your true nature are actually a spiritual, eternal entity apart from the body-mind complex. Now, Bhagavan Krishna, in chapter 14 of the Gita, he explains in great detail what are the different characteristics of the three gunas. And then he explains the qualities of the Trigunatitha. The Gunatitha is the person who has transcended the gunas. He explains this in shlokas 22 and 23. He says, Prakasham cha pravrittim cha moham eva cha pandava na dveshi sampravattani na nivrittani kankshati udasina vadasino gunaidyo na vichalyate guna vattanta ityeva yovatishtati nengate. So this is the translation. The Gunatitha, the realized soul who has transcended the gunas, is the person who is not affected by anything that happens in the mind. He is not troubled when the mind is turbulent or deluded. And even when the mind is not in a state of sattvic tranquility, he does not long for such a state. The Gunatitha is the person who is totally unshaken by the gunas, who stands far beyond the gunas, who sees that whatever is happening at the level of body and mind is nothing but the workings of the three gunas, and he stands apart, tranquil and unaffected. So this is what Bhagavan Krishna is saying. Now, we might ask, Bhagavan Krishna here is explaining the state of an enlightened soul, somebody who has transcended the gunas. But how does that apply to us? We're spiritual aspirants, we're sadhakas. We're still in a state of ignorance. We have not attained liberation. Bhagavan Shankaracharya, he says in a very beautiful place, in this context, he says that, I'll say the Sanskrit first, then I'll explain the translation. Sarvatraiva hi adhyatma shastre kritartha lakshanani yani tani eva sadhanani upadishyante yatna sadhyatvad. So what Shankara is saying is that in all scriptures relating to spirituality, in any place that the scriptures explain the characteristics of an enlightened person, those same characteristics become qualities that the sadhaka should try to cultivate. So that's the beauty of it. So in all the shastras, whenever you find descriptions of enlightened people, as spiritual aspirants, we should try to cultivate those same qualities. So in this context, all the qualities that Bhagavan Krishna is explaining regarding the person who has transcended the gunas, those become the practice of mindfulness. So what Bhagavan Krishna is saying is that whenever any thought arises in the mind, whether good or bad, whenever we have any bad, unpleasant or pleasant feelings that arise in the mind, we should take a step back from those feelings and from those thoughts and tell ourselves, we are the Atman, we are the eternal soul, separate from the body and separate from the mind. Swami Vivekananda, he repeatedly tells us to do this practice. In one place, for instance, he says, I am the infinite blue sky. Over me pass these clouds of various colors, remain a moment and vanish. I am the same eternal blue. I am the witness, the same eternal witness of all. So you'll find if you read Swamiji's lectures and complete works that again and again, one of the main practices that he teaches is no matter what is happening to you at the level of body and mind, just take one step back and tell yourself, I am the eternal witness, totally unaffected by anything that's happening at the level of body and mind. And this is the miracle, this is why I call it the miracle of Vedantic mindfulness. Many of you might know that there's a Buddhist monk named Thich Nhat Hanh. He wrote a book which was published in, I think, the 1970s called The Miracle of Mindfulness. And what I'm trying to explain today is that there's also a miracle of Vedantic mindfulness, which has two components. The first component is simply being aware of what's happening at the level of body and mind, but not reacting. And the second component is that you should at the same time identify with your higher spiritual nature. So this brings me to an important question. So I've already discussed that the Buddhists they're teaching a mindfulness practice throughout the world now. It's become very popular. And today I've been explaining also a Vedantic form of mindfulness. So what are the main differences between Buddhist mindfulness and Vedantic mindfulness? First of all, I'll just mention what they have in common. What they have in common is that both in Buddhist mindfulness and in Vedantic mindfulness, the main practice is to take a step back from whatever is happening at the level of the body and at the level of the mind. And just be aware of what's happening without reacting in any way. But the main difference is this. In Buddhism, so one of the earliest scriptures that teaches mindfulness in the Buddhist tradition is called Satipatthana Sutta. The Buddha himself taught this practice. And if you study the Satipatthana Sutta, you'll find that he teaches again and again, the main practice is you just follow the breath. As you inhale, you tell yourself, I'm now inhaling. When you exhale, you observe the breath as you're exhaling. Whenever a feeling arises in the mind, you tell yourself, I'm now feeling some X feeling, an unpleasant feeling or a pleasant feeling. When a thought arises in the mind, you simply say, I'm aware of this thought that's arising in my mind. But you'll find that in Buddhist practice, you never identify with a higher nature. The reason for that is because in Buddhism, they have a doctrine called anatta in Pali, which means the doctrine of no self or non-self. So the only practice in mindfulness with Buddhists is simply to be aware of what's happening in the body and in the mind. But in Vedantic mindfulness, there's an extra dimension, which is, we can call it the metaphysical dimension. The idea is that the mindfulness is based on the fact that in our higher nature, we are the eternal Atman. So this is the added element that you get in Vedantic mindfulness, which is very, very powerful. That's why Swamiji, again and again, Swami Vivekananda emphasizes that we are actually the eternal Sakshi, separate from the body and the mind. And I'll also just mention that in Raja Yoga, Swamiji encourages us to practice this mindfulness technique at the beginning of our japa and at the beginning of our meditation practice. The moment we sit down for meditation, he tells us the following. Swamiji says, the first lesson then is to sit for some time and let the mind run on. The mind is bubbling up all the time. It is like that monkey jumping about. Let the monkey jump as much as he can. You simply wait and watch. Knowledge is power, says the proverb, and that is true. Until you know what the mind is doing, you cannot control it. Give it the rein. Many hideous thoughts may come into it. You will be astonished that it was possible for you to think such thoughts. but you will find that each day the mind's vagaries are becoming less and less violent, that each day it is becoming calmer. So Swamiji gives us a very practical technique that we can practice in our daily meditation. The moment we sit down, just let the mind wander, let the mind run, and just observe what's happening in the mind without being disturbed, without reacting. And slowly you'll find that the mind itself calms down, and those thoughts will start to disappear. Let us pray to Sri Ramakrishna, Holy Mother Sharada Devi, and Swami Vivekananda that we, day by day, can grow in mindfulness and realize our true divine nature. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.